As chairman of the Department of English, may I once again welcome you on behalf of my colleagues to this, the second of the 1969 Ewing Lectures in Literature. Professor Kazin's general topic is American Writing Today, and his lecture this evening will treat the heroine as narrator. The third and final lecture in the series, The Absurd as a Contemporary Style, will be given on Thursday afternoon at 3 o'clock in this same auditorium. In introducing Professor Kazin at yesterday's session, I summarized so very inadequately the vital statistics, the dozen or so books, the hundreds of essays, the visiting professorships, the uncountable lectures at home and abroad. Professor Kazin comes to us, of course, not as a vital statistic, but as an extremely vital literary critic. In introducing him to you tonight, then, I should simply like to quote a few sentences from his very important essay on the function of criticism today. This is the concluding remark in Professor Kazin's 1962 collection of essays titled Contemporaries, a sort of an Arnoldian touchstone to a man who I feel is a somewhat Arnoldian critic. The essence of the modern movement is that it represents a permanent revolution of consciousness, an unending adventure into freedom. In the deepest sense, we can never study modern literature or art. We can only be a part of it. That is why criticism is important. We must practice criticism on the older writers lest they harden into the only acceptable writers. We must learn to practice criticism on the newer writers in order to bind them more truly to our own experience. We must practice criticism on our age while it is still here to show us its possibilities. Professor Alfred Kazin.
How do
A little bit of a trap. I think we'll do it this
cute. There should probably be a kiss on each cheek after that, French style. The heroine as narrator. The epigraph for this paper comes from, it's a paraphrase of Freud's famous remark, in 50 years of practice, I have never been able to discover an answer to the question, what do women want? Henry James said of her in an early travel note, quote, a certain habitual assurance which is only a grace to more. She combines all that is possible in the way of modesty with all that is delightful in the way of facility. He said of her in The Ambassadors, by a turn of the hand, she had somehow made their encounter a relation, and the relation profited by a mass of things that were not strictly in it or of it, by the very air in which they sat, by the high, cold, delicate room, by the world outside, and the little plash in the court, by the First Empire and the relics in the stiff cabinets, by matters as far off as those, and by others as near as the unbroken clasp of her hands in her lap, and the look her expression had of being most natural when her eyes were most fixed. George Eliot called her the frail vessel that carries the inestimable treasure of the world's affection. Flaubert, in a passage that characteristically shows up his determination to show life as banal, says, once during a thaw, the moisture was oozing out of the trees in the courtyard, the snow melting on the roofs of the outbuildings. She was on the threshold. She went to look for her parasol. She opened it. The parasol of silk, colored like a pigeon's breast and pierced by the sunlight, lit up with shifting reflections the white skin of her face. She smiled beneath it at the damp heat, and the drops of water could be heard falling one by one upon the stretched silk. Tolstoy described her as a round, smiling woman whose very way of walking created a bond between people looking at her. Dostoevsky has her trying to take all the anguish of a murderous soul into her own. Dreiser has her say to the man who's been keeping her for years, he said that if you married me, you would only get $10,000 a year. If you didn't and still lived with me, you would get nothing at all. But if you leave me, or I would leave you, you would get all of $1.5 million. Hadn't you better leave me now? Colette has her say, one night I dreamed that I did not love, and that night, released from all bonds, I lay as though in a kind of soothing death. She is not merely Anna or Natasha or Isabel or Madame de Villeneuve or Emma. She is the heroine, a figure who in so many of the Western novels that we know stands for the unique presence that harmonizes, composes, socializes our experience. She is, first of all, of course, the beloved, so much cherished that she has become the idea of what is cherishable. She is the object of so much striving and longing that she is the greatest possible symbol in Western fiction of our power to love. But more than a character, she is a principle of composition, Henry James's favorite word, and the connection between his heroines and his novels. She is a way of assuring manners, society, and civilization. And she stands for the other, even more than she does for a specific another. When Anna Karenina breaks the pact of selflessness that the heroine exists by, in which she has her being, Tolstoy makes it clear that she has violated a law of life and puts it as the epigraph to his novel. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. Now, the necessary association we have with this heroine is that whether she acts well or badly, or does not act at all for all practical purposes, she is being looked at. She is the object of much contemplation. As Henry James said in book after book, she makes the picture. As the picture, she becomes the occasion for sensibility and relatedness on everybody's part, and often in 19th century American fiction makes a genteel, frail book carry all the treasure of our affection. Especially in American fiction, where there have been so many men without women, so many whales and bears, misogynists, mad sea captains, solitary cowboys, the peculiar need of women as a civilizing agent has been to turn the heroine into a cultural ideal like the furnishings. The American novel is this year exactly a century old, the realistic novel. And in point of fact, there was no American novel until women came in as heroines. If it hadn't been for what Henry James called, quote, the American girl, that creation of genteel bachelors and valetudinarians, Captain Ahab would still be chasing his only love, Moby Dick, round and round the planet. Hemingway's terse description of the Italian girl in Across the River and Into the Trees, the most beautiful girl in the world, is, of course, a description not of a girl, but the name of an American idea. And the idea is so much of Italy as the romantic past and the reinvigoration of dwindling energies that the girl is really more an aura than a person. She holds things together in Colonel Cantwell's anguished mind, so she doesn't have to be real, and she isn't. To be pondered even when one is unreal, to be an object, an acquisition, a bibelot, this is to think of the heroine as most novelists of middle-class training have portrayed her, the only outlet from our commercial civilization. She is the cementing element, that which groups together by the very nature of the love and the passion for love that is, or used to be, the main business of the heroine. Now look away from this fixture of our literary culture, from her whose whole reason for existence is to be looked at and to be cherished with that special attentiveness that has been an essential element of fiction. Think of her now not as an object, not even as a writer, not even as the greatest women writers, Colette or Virginia Woolf, directly creating herself in the practice of fiction, outside all these categories formed by so much contemplation of her, even by women novelists. Approach for the first time a figure who has something to say to us, as now many other suppressed and neglected and over-symbolized human beings have emerged in our revolutionary world to say something out of their peculiar experience. Someone whose great value is that she can no longer say in advance what she wants. We may then value in women writers that element, perhaps not original, but certainly originating, which we are just beginning to notice in the valuably disturbing element practiced by so-called minorities. But to do this, we have to think of women creators, not just women characters, which is something that women critics like Kate Millay in her essay Sexual Politics and Mary Ellman in her book talking about women themselves don't do. When woman fashion, they lament and mock the way men write about women, a notorious scandal. Sartre says in his book, Jew and Anti-Semite, that a Jew is someone whom the world considers a Jew. This sentence understandably enrages Saul Bellow. But if one of the best minds of our time can so misunderstand the self-direction of other people, what shall we say of those women critics who describe women only as characters who are underrated in the minds of men? Here, numbers are important. There are more women novelists today in America than there ever were before. They are many. Unlike the Ellen Glasgows and Edith Whartons of 70 years ago, they are not solitary freaks in the aristocratic class, lonely rebels against the genteel tradition. Unlike the moralistic New England lady novelists of the 19th century, who by the sheer bulk of their pages and the mighty sound of their voices replaced the New England ministry, they are not necessarily purer than other human beings. In short, they are no longer exceptional because privileged. They come out of the modern crowd, and in many respects, they too make up a crowd. Mary McCarthy, Jane Bowles, Hortense Kalischer, Grace Paley, Susan Sontag, Marguerite Young, there are many. They are in the flow of modern American life, and its discontinuities and breakings up appear in their books. We recognize, as we do with so-called minority writers, a powerful indictment of civilization as a lie, a passionate outcry against possibilities that can no longer be met, an eroticism that is a plea for life and for more strength and autonomy. The protest is, of course, often still against the limitations of their experience, a sense of being excluded. But along with this, there is even more that sense of the feminine as a physical exceptionality, which Proust, so profoundly feminine himself, expressed perfectly when he said that a writer is someone who has to use an injured muscle. Louis Ferdinand Céline, a very great writer, and of course a doctor as well, once said in a remarkable interview, "Woman is very troubled because clearly she has every known weakness. She wants to stay young. She has her menopause, her periods, the whole genital business, which is very delicate. It makes a martyr out of her, doesn't it? So this martyr lives anyway. She bleeds, she doesn't bleed, she goes and gets the doctor, she has operations. She doesn't have operations. She gets reoperated. Then in between she gives birth, she loses her shape. Oh, that's important," said Céline. She wants to stay young, keep her figure. Well, she doesn't want to do a thing, and she can't do a thing. She hasn't any muscle. It's an immense problem, hardly recognized. It supports the beauty parlors, the quacks, and the druggists. But it doesn't present an interesting medical problem, woman's decline. It's obviously a fading rose. You can't say it's a medical problem or an agricultural problem. In a garden, when you see a rose fade, you accept it. Another one will bloom. Whereas in woman, she doesn't want to die. That's the hard part. Now, the fading rose, the end of youth, the sense of departing powers, these are particularly marked in the bitterness of Catherine Ann Porter's Ship of Fools. This novel was begun many years ago as No Safe Harbor, and over the years turned into Ship of Fools. The long voyage from Veracruz to Hamburg, which the militant Catherine Ann Porter took in the early 30s, she then conceived as the symbolic voyage into the dissolution of the West on the eve of World War II. But the many years in which Miss Porter tried to assemble her many scenes into one novel themselves, these years, became the subject of her novel. The voyage became actually her inability to finish the book. And the older and more dismayed Miss Porter got in the writing of it, the more her point of view shifted from the political anger that had influenced her in the 30s, from her image of society as a falling tower, her own famous phrase, to the baleful but perhaps more authentic, because biological belief that life itself is a foolish enterprise, while time makes monkeys, dwarfs, and dupes of us all. In her book, thereupon, the anticipated deterioration of Germany on the eve of Hitler became window dressing. Yet the novel, finally coming out in 1962, found many readers, partly because of this physical balefulness and touchiness, the catastrophism of the headlong 60s in a form easy to read and easy to take. A whole generation of English majors, trained by the new critics, had had their idea of fiction formed by those marvelous stories by Miss Porter, which in their laconic irony express perfectly the contrast between the moral character of her heroines and their contracted destiny. In Miss Porter's stories, the key figure of the heroine stands for the eager life force, for the artist in life. Woman becomes a work of art in a world stupid with violence. She is a work of art within the larger work of art by Miss Porter, whose whole aim in these beautiful stories is to establish the existential reality of a woman's emotion against the destructiveness made by poverty and revolution. But now the woman's real complaint is that life is a cheat. In Ship of Fools, the young girl in love is all that is left of this original heroine figure. She has been kept as an index of the time, forever young, and perhaps remains too young ever to be disillusioned. The sensibility has grown sour, but conceals this in the episodic nature of the actions. One can say of this book, Ship of Fools, that Miss Porter's marvelous sense of style in all things froze into stereotypes of her 30s and mislaid her old natural sympathy. It breaks down into stories merely, it breaks down into venom. Ship of Fools is an extraordinarily ungenerous book, in many scenes quite poisonous. Yet in Miss Porter's stories, one was always aware of an elegant, a proud gift for artistic economy. This was brought to bear against the harshness of the Mexican landscape, and this made exquisite forms of her stories. This, in fact, was, as in the case of many great short story writers, her feminine genius. The short story in America has been a more powerful drama than the theater. Again and again, one sees in certain, quote, almost perfect stories, unquote, as they are lovingly studied in American classrooms, that veneration of purely personal sensitivity, which is the particular mark of the New Yorker, and which makes the fiction of the New Yorker so distinctly feminine in its aesthetic sense. Indeed, J.D. Salinger's stories are really about moral genius, sainthood, and its extreme loneliness. There is a necessary bond between so much sensitivity and the ironic, shifting moods of the story that alone can give form to this problem, key problem in feminine fiction, of the static hero or heroine. In Franny and Zooey and other of Salinger's more recent stories, there is a rejection of the world that opts for the most disdainful kind of masochism. You must overcome your disgust, says Zooey to his sister Franny, she was so troubled, and see the fat lady whom you dislike as Jesus Christ. There is a necessary connection between Seymour's despair, which removes him from the world, and the short story as a form, swift, spare, strange, disburdened of gross reality. When sensitivity, a word that is less pretentious than sensibility, a word we can hardly, a word less pretentious than sensibility, for we can hardly overlook the personal horror and suffering in Salinger's stories. When this is its own reason for despair, a story exerts its power by an instinct of exclusion. This is as strict in its judgment of the world as it is in its economy of art. For Salinger, as much as for Miss Porter, this world is a ship of fools. Salinger, too, has never written a novel, but he has added cameo after cameo of distinguished suffering to his gallery. So much elegance is a bit archaic. Perhaps the sensitive plant is equally so, not least, as I shall try to show, among women writers now. On the other hand, literary sensibility in this extreme, pervading form brings us back to the charged up consciousness of self that has become so insistent a fact in our writing. And the more collectivized, the more uniform the world becomes, the more significant the feminine becomes as a symbol of the unassimilable self. The self has often become the world to express, and in the feminine genius there is a belief in total self-expressiveness. The influence of the feminine can be seen in that amazing convention of loneliness on the American stage, which makes it unique. In plays like Carson McCullers' The Member of the Wedding and Tennessee Williams' The Glass Menagerie. What is specifically feminine in the American mode is the cry, "Who am I? What work is there for me? In what language of my own am I to express my being?" All these writers I have mentioned, except Salinger, but certainly including Miss Porter, are Southern writers. It is not easy in talking about Southern writers in general to say how much their solitariness is due to the contrast between the tradition and the reality. There are a lot of fables here to get over, not least those produced by Southerners themselves. But the South has produced writers as the Dark Ages produced saints, the gifted few who can read the burning letters for themselves in the book of slavery, hate, war, and poverty. Nevertheless, there is a book, a legend, created by so much pastness. The South Carolina gentleman who in post-time wouldn't give a cent to keep a local magazine alive, saying they could get all their reading matter from England, were the kind of enemy at home who helped to make Faulkner strong by isolation. But if we ask to what extent Columbus, Georgia helped to make Carson McCullers and Milledgeville, Georgia helped to make Flannery O'Connor, the answer is less easy to formulate. Each in her own way was doomed from an early age and knew it. Each was dependent upon her family for the sparse number of characters so recurrent in her fiction. Each was a woman novelist in an environment that excited her by its brooding violence. And yet, in each case, one that by its insistent conventions made her feel that she was a freak. One reason is that their fiction does not describe any passionately urgent connection between women and men. In Carson McCullers, what fills this empty space, which used to be occupied by love, is a receptivity to bleakness that is absolutely total. One is either too young for love, as in The Member of the Wedding and The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, or too odd for it, as in The Ballad of the Sad Cafe. There, the odd woman and her odd husband, and even more her odd hunchback lover, combine to create solitudes so extreme that they mock Rilke's line that in solitudes, lovers discover each other. Solitudes so extreme as those of the Weirdies in Reflections in a Golden Eye, of the two deaf mutes and the young girl in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, of the old Negro mammy and the girl in The Member of the Wedding. Carson McCullers radiated in all her work, as in her person to those who knew her well, a demand for love so total that she could not believe in its existence. The other, in the French sense, the other was to be the perfect giver, and so became unreal. The young girl, a suppliant, would remain unappeased. The atmosphere of longing pervades her early and late work like a gas, numbing us with sympathy. But her other drive as an artist was toward a clarity of style and selectivity of detail so extreme as to make life otherworldly, a fairy tale. In what I take to be her best single work, The Ballad of the Sad Cafe, emotionally the most disinterested of her fictions, her natural dislike of realism, flowers into a tale wholly grotesque of a backwoods humor mixed with fantasy. She begins, as she always begins, quote, "The town itself is dreary, is lonesome, sad, and like a place that is far off and estranged from all other places in the world," unquote. But for once, this usually lonesome Georgia town stage is filled up with a magic working figure, Miss Amelia Evans, who was once married, had a brief and unsatisfactory time of it, and since then has come to exercise a weird power over the town and the chorus of its inhabitants. She is the wonder-working amateur doctor to the sick and powerless people. She binds up their wounds. She cures with marvelous personal remedies. She also has all the business in town and lives with all necessary papers neatly filed around her. The other characters are childlike in their helplessness. In her fantastic sufficiency to all occasions, Miss Amelia Evans shows what a woman past love can do with her powers. The singularity of both her power and her sexlessness is complete. At the end, her exasperated ex-husband is released from prison and seeks her out to bring her back to his world of passion. She fights it out with him physically in a long, drawn-out comic battle of frontier fisticuffs that betrays her desire to lose and her inability to get any profit out of her magic strength except the solitude which feeds it. In Flannery O'Connor's fiction, we start beyond the line of sexual love. It is never an issue. The characters are recurrently the mother, the child, the brother, and other angries, a word I don't think invented, but a word which I hope I'm pronouncing properly. It's spelled A-N-G-R-I-E-S. It's a noun. Angries. Different from enragé, which is only found among students. There are many angries, especially landowners and their tenant farmers, so that the cardinal elements of humanity, which are more real to O'Connor than so-called personalities, cohere by conflict. Now, what is feminine about her fiction, what is the original and originating element both, is her fatalistic trust in her own truth. Hers is not a world of people made lonely by their freakishness, not simply a rural world that turns characters fanatical, as in Hardy or Faulkner, but one that subsists on the belief that all human beings are absolutely limited. All people in this uniform condition of silence seem to be the same age. Her stories, more effective than her two novels, Wise Blood and The Violent Bear It Away, are of a crazy human disposition to error. They are as amazing in their stoic self-sufficiency as the short stories of Stephen Crane. Their only significant fault, if it is one, is that they are all too much alike. The current situation always is our fatal human disposition to turn every petty issue into the greatest possible mistake. Mr. Fortune, an old man who wildly loves his granddaughter, who thinks her the only person at all like himself, tries to absorb her will entirely into his own. He kills her in an hysterical protest against an obstinacy just like his own. A young boy, away from his sophisticated city parents, in the company of a madly religious babysitter, gets baptized. And Flannery O'Connor writes, where he lived, everything was a joke. From the preacher's face, he knew immediately that nothing the preacher said or did was a joke. He returns home, but has to go back to the river. And she adds, he intended not to fool with preachers anymore, but to baptize himself and to keep on going this time until he found the kingdom of Christ in the river. In the title story, Everything That Rises Must Converge, a young Southern liberal on the race question, hopelessly irritated by his mother's obtuse, old-fashioned prejudices, finds after a short bus ride that everything has come to a complete stop. His mother collapses on the street after being pushed out of the way by an angry Negro woman to whose child she loftily tried to offer a penny. And Flannery O'Connor writes, "The lights drifted farther away the faster he ran for help, and his feet moved numbly as if they carried him nowhere. The tide of darkness seemed to sweep him back to her, postponing from moment to moment his entry into the world of guilt and sorrow." In the story that bears his name, Greenleaf, Mrs. May's outrageously inefficient tenant farmer can never keep the bull penned in, and she is finally gored to death by a carelessness on his part that is really, of course, total hostility. And Flannery O'Connor writes, "She looked back and saw that the bull, his head lowered, was racing toward her. She remained perfectly still, not in fright, but in a freezing unbelief. She stared at the violent black streak bounding toward her as if she had no sense of distance, as if she could not decide at once what his intention was. And the bull had buried his head in her lap like a wild, tormented lover before her expression had changed. One of his horns sank until it pierced her heart, and the other curved around her side and held her in an unbreakable grip. She continued to stare straight ahead, but the entire scene in front of her had changed. The tree line was a dark wound in a world that was nothing but sky, and she had the look of a person whose sight had been suddenly restored, but who finds the light unbearable." Here, Flannery O'Connor's habitual dryness rises to eloquence only in the death throe. And the Pascalian perfection of her phrasing takes us out of time into that last possible thought before death. There is an intense sense of the immediate scenery in her work, but doesn't have to be the South. And it isn't the South. The place in which these stories take place is simply that which backs up this recurrent fault in ourselves, this abysmal disposition to do the wrong thing and to be wrong. Her characters are souls of resentment who must express themselves in ominous silences, ragged figures, and unbelievable violence. Now, many Southern writers are fascinated by original sin. Robert Penn Warren is notable among writers, both as a poet and as a novelist, who's constantly concerned with this as an idea, and has written many, many pages about it, extremely eloquent, deeply unbelievable, to get over what obviously haunts him in the guilt of slavery. But Flannery O'Connor really believed in original sin. And she reminds me of that fiercest of all Catholic writers, Joseph de Maistre, who said in the famous Les Soirées de Saint Petersburg that only an executioner keeps man's total untrustworthiness from turning society into chaos. Now, the fascinations of Flannery O'Connor's work to me are many. She is one of the few, perhaps the only Catholic writer of fiction in our day. I omit converts like Evelyn Waugh as being too convert-like. Remind me always of the immortal line that Robert Frost addressed to Alan Tate when Tate was a Catholic convert. Tate came into a reception in the Library of Congress with a priest, and Frost, whose prejudices were aroused by the sight of the priest, and by another poet, I should say, said to the priest, "Father, are you a convert?" And the priest, who was an Irish Catholic, said, "Certainly not." And Frost said, "Neither am I, shake." She is one of the few Catholic writers of fiction in our day, I omit converts like Evelyn Waugh, who managed to fuse a thorough orthodoxy with the greatest possible independency or sophistication as an artist. And that includes even that beautiful writer, Francois Mauriac. Once on a visit to Milledgeville, Georgia, her parish priest, driving me to see her, told me with some amazement that she constantly berated him for admiring conventional magazine fiction. Yet her own stories show that the church, which has a physical character she used very rarely in her work, and then in a mood of relaxed satire at her own expense, was so supreme in her own mind as to be invisible. The world of what she calls the world of guilt and sorrow, the light that has been restored but is now unbearable. These ultimates are almost platonic in their severity. The real world, real in quotes, is the Bible Belt. Reality is sin and error multiplied by Georgia fanaticism. No wonder that the situations are so hypnotic, that the characters are so synonymous, that the time of the drama is any time. The place is the bull that kills, the river in which the boy drowns himself to baptize himself. Not at all a place you remember for itself, like directories in those marvelous stories by J.F. Powers of American priests. Flannery O'Connor's severity is an intrinsic view of the world, a formal matter of style. Her stories remain in your mind as inflexible moral equations. The drama is in the short distance between the first intimations of conflict and the catastrophe. Her characters are souls contracted to this world and so forced to crash against it. They rush to their fate in the few pages needed to get them going at all. And I am fascinated by this severity in a woman writer, by its authority, its repetition. And though I know the external facts, I still wonder at its human source. She inherited the dread circulatory disease of lupus, died of it before she was 40, knew she had it from the time she began to write. All her work was written under the influence of this death sentence. She was also a blue stocking in a Georgia town faked with gentility. The local daughters of the Confederacy liked to babify her as one of Milledgeville's authors, but probably would not have enjoyed her real views about human nature or her mystical, not tribal sense of her isolation as an Irish Catholic girl smack in the middle of the Bible Belt. She was a doomed young woman who had nothing to do in her short life but write fiction. And there are recurrent examples of the mother and the precocious, peculiarly neuter figure of the child who so early sees all, knows all, and forgives no one. The psychological sources of her fiction are, I think, ignored by her brilliant admirer and biographer, Robert Fitzgerald, the poet. And one might think that she wrote fiction only to explain the true religion to the heathen. Yet these are less important than the criticism she makes as a woman, even more reduced to inaction than most women, of power. She links power and ownership to violence, and people move into violence by disposition to treat the world as entirely theirs. What she is uncompromising about is the uselessness of mere doing, about the illusion, not just the male vanity involved in the despotic show of will. Again and again, her stories turn on fights over land and over children. People in her stories go mad with temper trying to keep things up that exist only in their minds. Often, the characteristically resentful character is a widow, alone in middle age, whose dream is no longer of personal happiness, but the preservation of property as her only respectability. And then the illusion takes the form of physical tragedy. The human quality, at once dull and savage, is that of the animal world, to which O'Connor always goes for her imagery. But what people are most to her is their disproportion to the world. Human beings, in her view, are nothing but their moral natures, which sit in them like sacks waiting to be emptied out into the world of action. The world is necessarily an empty place for her. The external counts only as a trigger. Her art is entirely unhistorical. The only real world remains the primal fault. What people do is always grotesque. Now, to see life with such detachment from the bustling, all-consuming power world is not to satirize it, but to turn one's back on it. Only a Southerner could even have attempted this much relinquishment. In our present world of glut, only a woman of an austerity so scriptural as by our present standards to seem mad could have done it. Perhaps Flannery O'Connor owed this, quote, madness to that femaleness which almost never comes into her fiction for its own sake, or even to that self-protecting sensitivity which is, of course, often a leading character in women's fiction. Flannery O'Connor found another language for this, a wider set of references. The vulnerability of women is the theme over and over again of Shirley Jackson's stories. Her most famous one, The Lottery, is only a more intensely horrible version. Remember that the whole town gathers together to stone the woman. There's only a more intensely horrible version of the assault, deception, betrayal, which occurs in so many stories where a woman as victim is the main figure and where her defenselessness is the story. In Jean Stafford's stories, one sees a situation turning on a young woman's inability to form lasting relationships. A lasting ruefulness or mockery about love, about being out of love, past love, is the voice that holds together Grace Paley's stories. These writers, and many more, are concerned with love rather than sexuality. But in the last few years, one of the recurrent themes among younger women writers who have had experiences as rough as a man's has been the sexuality of life and thought in prison, as in Catherine de Dunn's stories, or in the cold water flats of Bohemia, as in the stories of Rosalind Drexler. And moving up several social levels from prison and Bohemia, we come to the dissatisfied wife. In the novels of Alison Lurie, the chief figure is always that of a wife whose husband is an organization man of one kind or another, at a college, an insurance company, a research corporation. Her rebellion against such ties, his ties, takes the form of an affair with an artist or composer or psychoanalyst. The resolution is not love for either husband or lover, but the recognition of her own true nature, the rejection of the convention forced on her by her husband. Alison Lurie's novels are earnest, smooth satires of the New England College, the Los Angeles Research and Development Corporation, the hippie scene, the writer's colony. They are gotten up like research projects, are full of information, insistent on surface detail in the way of other women writers who have felt like spies when allowed into the husband's office. Their theme is still the woman's psychological identity, which makes it a passive one, when the woman is outside the organization where all the interesting fights are taking place. The men and women in her novels belong by occupation to different species, which makes the exchange of vital information impossible, and sex the only possible. Indeed, bed is the only place where her men and women can converse. But the differences between them cannot be resolved so long as men feel all important to the world and women not at all. Maybe this will be more and more a significant theme in women's writing, sexuality as the expression of the necessary misunderstanding between the sexes. Pornography, says Stephen Marcus, is a form of pseudo-radicalism. The scolding obscenities in Catherine Dunn's prison fiction are a pseudo-radical protest, if you like, against the physical difficulties of being a woman in a man's prison. But in what follows for the bourgeois wife in Alison Lurie's fiction is the kind of ironic sense of detail with which one makes fun of another woman's dress after a dinner party. The nagging attention to small details is fundamental in a status society. I call this the observation post. For the writer who notices so much is like the heroine who observes for dear life in order to keep her end up. In Alison Lurie's first novel, Love and Friendship, the wife complains after making love out of doors when her lover goes off to meet a class, but it's only 10 practically. What do I do the rest of the morning? In Real People, the wife of an insurance executive, free to write at last at an artist colony, writes bitterly, really, I want to write all the stories I've thought of and then discarded because they might shock or hurt someone. Only, of course, I can't. Jerry said I had a patron, as writers did in the 17th and 18th centuries, and it's true. Clark and all the rest of them are my patrons, just as much as the English lords were Dryden's or Popes. There is the same avoidance of all topics which might annoy them, the same gross or subtle glorification of their way of life, the same praise of their virtues, reliability, good taste, justice, moderation, and blindness to their faults. Hopeless. The whole thing is hopeless. And yet, her observations never flag, for the need of occupation is so insistent that everything gets noticed, especially where the scene is entirely new, as in the book called The Nowhere City, a book about Los Angeles. There, the wife, having just made love with her employer, a psychoanalyst, demurely sits down, still naked, to take dictation, for he still has a few minutes before his next patient. Bridget Brophy, the English-Irish writer, who was all Freudian, has said about the detective story contemptuously that it cannot be taken seriously as a form because it fails to risk the author's ego and is therefore mere fantasy. Alison Lurie's novels certainly do risk the ego. That is what they are about, the necessary risk. They are so far from being fantasy that they are anxious in their documentation. Thick with worldliness and social information, we never get away from the middle-class mind she wants to satirize. In this context, perhaps one should speak only of women writers who remind one of no other women writers. And Joyce Carol Oates does not always remind me even of herself. There is an abundance in her work, an ability to shift her strength from book to book that shows how much she owes to the extraordinary profusion of life in the United States just now. Miss Oates is not an expectable center of sensibility in the way that some women geniuses, like Virginia Woolf, have been. Her essential quality seems to me a peculiar gift for moving with people's lives as they understand them, a gift for finding out what people think moves them. She is a social novelist of a new kind, concerned not with the emergence of power relations, as earlier realists were, but with the struggle of people nowadays to express their fate in terms that are cruelly changeable. Reading her, one sees the real tragedy of so many Americans today, unable to find a language for what is happening to them, beyond the point of trying to find a fixed point to locate order as a necessary fiction. The drama of our society was once seen from this dividing line between the individual and the mass. It has now become the drama within which each person carries a mythology around with him, an idea of causation unrelated to any cause, even to right and wrong. In the older social novels of the century, the novelist was the pathfinder and the characters were often blind, as helpless victims of their fate as Hershwood and Sister Carrie, or almost all the characters in Dos Passos' USA. In Joyce Carol Oates' fiction, people are not that far behind her. And their innocent reasoning is so constantly before us that we see their minds in motion from moment to moment, like faces in films. As Father Jean Leroux has noted in his review of her last book, Them, I should say here that the most brilliant review was written by Professor Adams of this department. The actions of her characters are all on the surface because that is where they lead their lives. The most interesting thing to me about Joyce Oates' fiction is this. Seeing people in the terms they present to themselves, she is able to present consciousness as a floating body, as a humorously physical thing. She is empathically related to the flow of their consciousness, but with no more sympathy than there is rejection. I have read in explanation of her amazing productivity that she works a book out in her mind and then merely types it out. This may explain my intuition of her as someone who easily takes in what other people are thinking about, who moves and flows with minds, her own not least, around the accidents, around the catastrophes, the violences that punctuate contemporary America in her work. She knows all about the natural repetitions that have been the woman novelist's traditional métier, but she is aware, in a sense almost Marxist, that quantity does change the quality of this cycle. And her subject is a life force not of the individual, but in families, groups, even cities. In her latest novel, Them, our attention is always directed back to Detroit itself. Detroit, a city she has described as all melodrama. There, in her work, A man can get shot by the brother of a woman he is lying next to in bed, and the body will be disposed of by a friendly policeman. The brother himself pops up later in the sister's life, not as a, quote, murderer, but as a genially obtuse and merely wistful fellow. Nothing of this is satirized or moralized at once it would have been. It is what happens every day now. There are too many people for murders to count. There are too many murderers for the murderer to take murder that seriously. Mass society as organism is now the point, not the conscience that once made the individual all important to himself. And this Joyce Carol Oates understands with a facility, should I say, a voluminousness that shows how much she has soaked up, as only a young writer can, of the new intricacies that make up our lives. This is fiction, new not in form or style, but in its ability to express the current overpoweringness without rejecting it as meaningless or absurd. In the extraordinary author's note to them, she calls it a work of history in fictional form. She says that is in personal perspective, which is the only kind of history that exists, and explains that it is based on the family history, the problems, complexity of a student she had at the University of Detroit. She reports that this student's various problems and complexities overwhelmed me, and that it is to Maureen Wendell's terrible obsession with her own personal history that I owe the voluminous details of this novel. So much material, she said, had the effect of temporarily blocking out my own reality, my personal life, and substituting for it the various nightmare adventures of the Wendell family. Their lives pressed upon mine eerily, so I began to dream about them instead of about myself, dreaming and redreaming their lives. Because their work was so remote from me, it entered me with tremendous power, and in a sense, the novel wrote itself. Now the title, Them, Miss Oates says, is there because it refers to a specific them, based upon Maureen Wendell's numerous recollections. But the word them also carries, for me, Miss Oates' sense of how much our society is now class-structured, hierarchically divided between those who think of themselves as the establishment, and in their prosperity and importance, think of those who threaten as them. Them may also mean all those people in a lower class who disturb us in this specific sense, that they press on our lives, but we do not want to think about them. Them is what is about their lives. Them is what is too gross to pass through the fine meshes of ordinary literary intelligence. Now, merely assertive radicalism, non-fictional radicalism, can also say them without taking them in. All the more interesting, then, that Miss Oates can get into this work as, quote, personal perspective, which is the only kind of history that exists, unquote. The book opens in August 1937 with the figure of a girl in love standing before her mirror. It ends, after the Detroit riot of 1968, with the two children of that girl, Jules and Maureen Wendell, saying goodbye to each other. Miss Oates, who was born in 1938, likes to begin her novels with a scene out of the 1930s. The first novel in the social trilogy, A Garden of Earthly Delights, begins with the birth on the highway of a child after the truck transporting migrant workers has been in an accident. Ms. Oates obviously feels that the 30s mark the onset of a social crisis that rages even more virulently now under the form of permanent affluence. She has a sense of this whole period from the 30s to the 60s as the key period in the transformation of America into the glut, the junk that is her key image. In the second volume, Expensive People, which is a bad book, but obviously necessary to her thinking, her horror of the distracting, confusing American overabundance is expressed in the fat narrator's tales of his gluttony and his vomiting. Expensive People is entirely unsuited to her gifts, for satire is no more her thing than a short book is. She needs room for the many directions in which her characters move and she needs intellectual sympathy. Abundance also becomes her problem as she skips disapprovingly in this book, Expensive People, from item to item of the gross national product. Expensive People is about social fantasies so strong that Miss Oates, disapproving of them, keeps these characters deliberately unreal. They are ridiculous versions of each other, like the different corporations the father is always joining, and the new houses they move into as easily as into a new car. In them, the abundance is a puzzling, intimidating presence, expressing itself in forces forever coming into physical collision. A lover murdered in bed, Jules firing the barn, an airplane crashing in a field, a decapitation. Her great symbol for it is so different from the inventory I'll be discussing in the Novels of the Absurd. Her great symbol for it is the amount of junk everywhere in and around American houses, cars, and garages. These ancient products, this stuff, cannot easily be gotten rid of. They surround the poor even more than the rich with a meaningless weight that is like a threatening presence from another planet. Yet characteristically, the stuff is there because the people in them are themselves looking at it. Miss Oates does not describe this from any omniscient and condescending point of view. It is the life in the form of junk, stuff, possessions that holds us down, that keeps us from changing, the role that we Americans get clogged up with. And she says in one remarkable passage, which I've left out many lines, but their father sat across from them, silent again. He must have been thinking of something else, not hearing them. What did their father think of? Of his job, of his sick, stinking mother, of a Social Security pension, of the car breaking down again, of the rent on this dump of a house, of the niggers moving in a few blocks away, of his wife's silent padding and bedroom slippers out in the kitchen. Nor was he thinking of his daughter egging him on to give his son a good slap across the face, which the son deserved. Nor was he thinking of the bell-bottom green lamps on the table beside him, nor of the Detroit News half read on the floor, nor of the radiator with its fake wood top and its row of little glass birds, nor of a silhouette picture on the wall of a gracious lady with a superior nose, one of Laurette's touches, nor of the grimy, ripped red slipcover on the sofa, nor of Jules's rotting sneakers and Betty's rotting teeth. So many decaying things just now. Are people equal to lifting themselves above all this stuff? Not easily. Miss Oates has established better than anyone else, better than any other new novelist, the frailty of the person compared with the excessiveness of the social power. But it can hardly be said that she speaks for measure for moral economy, for an awareness like Flannery O'Connor's of our limited strength. Jules Wendell is almost whimsically radicalized after the Detroit riot. Then he says goodbye to his sister Maureen and goes off. This episode, like Maureen's irrational, passionate marriage to her teacher, ruining lives, expresses those comings and goings that are Joyce Oates' deepest subject. She is a novelist of mind, playing the mind out to the farthest boundary of our social upheaval. Thank you.